of basically nearly every election is cast as a referendum on sovereignty again, as opposed to, and I think I said to you the last time, there are other examples where confessional parties, in continental Europe, in Germany and in the Netherlands, after the Second World War, migrated into, the Christian Democrats, socialists on the other side, Christian Democrats on the right, and more normal sort of, political choices around health and education. But if you're within the Northern Ireland democratic space right now, you're not voting and you're not offered a manifesto based upon the normal democratic choices that people would vote on in a society. You're offered, something that keeps the border and sovereignty front and center. And I thought we were sort of potentially moving away from that. But actually Brexit has brought us back to that. So if I were looking at this and thinking, how would you try to solve this in a more equitable and amicable way? Where somebody can be both rather than either or, then surely the territory could be both rather than either or. And that might be a better interim solution. An interim should be quite a long period. And it reflects, in a sense, the reality of the society on the ground. It's a highly contested space. And, we are where we are. Now, that potentially, that was there before Brexit. That was my view before Brexit, that actually, after Brexit, from a legal and political and then social point of view, I just try to figure out, if you have 25% of your population in the northeast of a future, single territory who don't want to be there, how do you build cohesion? And how do you avoid repeating some of the pitfalls and mistakes of the past on the British side? But now the Irish side would be doing it, where there's an element of coercion and you build in sort of the seeds of alienation, etc. So it's, that Italian word, piano, piano, slowly, slowly. How do you demystify? How do you de-escalate? How do you, bring your neighbours with you? So the joint sovereignty piece could be one which gives the society quite a long, definitive time to just settle. The other potential, if that's, the other framework then is around, revisiting the architecture of the Government of Ireland Act. And it's around, I think, two parliaments dealing with high degrees of autonomy for domestic policy, very restricted sovereign powers operating at a federal level. So a sort of an Australian type of federation. So in that sense, you would see Stormont continuing within the territorial mandate of current status of Northern Ireland. You would see either a federated structure in the rest of Ireland or the continuation of Dáil Éireann or a more provincial sort of devolution in the Republic, but a sort of a federal thing sitting with the likes of foreign policy, defence policy, etc. So that's where, if I come back to your very opening question, at the moment, nobody knows what a united Ireland would look like. If you have a situation where what's on offer in a referendum choice is the continuation of Stormont, all the checks and balances of the Belfast Agreement, and very limited reserved powers at a federal All-Ireland basis, then in my view, that is a lot less intimidating to some people than perhaps, their worst fears about being absorbed into a system where there's no checks and balances. And it's back to the message and the messenger. And you're onto a really, really good question as to, when you asked about a commission or something like this, who would be the person of status and standing that would command respect and fairness from all sides, who would pursue it accurately rather than through advocacy? Because you don't want to coerce one side or the other. So those are the sorts of things, but I do think privately, and you're very good to pick out, but the joint sovereignty thing for me is a way to solve and settle the issue for me privately from sort of a Christian perspective of the solution to this issue should not be for me to swap my alienation or hurt onto someone else.
So how would joint sovereignty work in a situation of the UK being out of the EU and Ireland being in the EU and Northern Ireland half in and half out?
Well, those are practical.
Okay.
Those are practical, policies that you would have to look at in a whole variety of ways, and you'd probably have some sort of joint commission or something of this nature. The question is, whose taxation laws, and the protocol already crosses a boundary here, because it basically says, within Europe, or within the single, Northern Ireland is within the single market for X, Y, and Z. The question is around, what would your taxation level be? What would your foreign policy be? What would your military policy be? What would the standards of justice be? So you're talking about sort of, if you got the balance right between Stormont itself deciding, on that whole raft of devolved power, so a very high degree of devolution to Stormont, but the reserved powers being overseen by a joint commission of, Britain and Ireland, but a duality of head of state, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there's some examples in some parts of the world, precious few, but, and maybe somebody might say that's an indication, that you need to take into account, but it's preferable to, I think, a sort of either a dysfunctional sort of, split within the society, but it's trying to sort of take that contentious sovereignty issue and put it in a shared space which reflects the reality and composition on the ground.
What I like about that is that, because I've been asking people this, is how do you take one group of people who have, like, the essence of identity is an emotional sense of attachment to something that you can't even really explain. Now, I've been following Manchester United since 1958, since I was a kid. Now, I never saw Manchester United play. I never heard them on the radio, but I knew there was this awful crash and all their star players were killed, including two from Northern Ireland, Danny Blanchford.
Yes.
And that stuck with me throughout my whole life. I still look them up
Yes.
and see how they're doing.
Yes.
I
Yes.
think they're upset when I see Manchester City in front of them. Okay?
Yes.
So
Yes.
why? Well, can't explain it to you, but that's what's there. So if you have this emotional attachment to your sense of Britishness, how in a dispensation that it belongs to, how can you take that